All right, here we are, Mr. Keith Townsend. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Mr. Tim Crawford. Feels like I just, saw you in person last week, it feels like.
Yeah, quick time, quick turnaround. We're back in our respective home offices. Great to be back on. For those of you that don't know us, I'm Tim Crawford. I'm a CIO and strategic advisor with AVOA.
And
And
I'm
Keith,
Keith and I'm Keith Townsend, the CTO advisor with the CTO advisor, founder and principal.
that's great. And so we thought we would just spend a few minutes and kind of do a recap of the Amazon reInvent conference, but then also talk about the outage that took place this week right on the heels of the conference. I'm sure those two events were not scheduled in that way, but seeing as how we've got two events with the same company and a lot of conversation, let's kind of dig into it. Keith, what was kind of some of the things that you mentioned in our quick little video that we did at the event last week, what were some takeaways that you've kind of had a chance to marinate on and think about that are kind of standing out for you? I mean, let's start with the new CEO and kind of get your take there.
Adam Zelinsky. I'll get
Zelensky.
as he becomes more, prominent. We'll hear more about him. So the keynote in general and Adam's approach. So if we remember Andy Jassy, famous for these 2 hour long marathons of announcements and assurance. So Adam took a little bit different route, less technical announcements, more customer stories,
Hmm.
and really Amazon really leaning into I think what their superpower is, which is the ability to get customers on stage talking about the value that Amazon brings as a partner. I think they leaned more into that. So from a executive level, I thought it was a better executive level presentation because it was more there if you're not just a pure technologist.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, there was a market shift in the tone cadence for Adam as opposed to Andy. Andy was always really good about kind of running through what the highlights were of the different products and really kind of catering to the developer audience. And that's great. But I think the one hole that Amazon has really struggled with is attracting that enterprise audience. And in order to do that, you have to have a different vernacular. You have to have a different conversation at a different level. And one of the things that I saw in Adam, both in the keynote and then as part of the analyst Q&A, is that he's much more focused on outcomes. What are the business outcomes? Not, hey, use this technology and you'll have this outcome, but rather, what's the big problem that you're trying to solve for? And let's resonate on that. And then let's talk about what technologies you can use to do that. And we saw that whether you were talking about that really interesting company that's kind of taking data from space,
Hmm.
or we saw it with Adina when she got up and talked about NASDAQ and what they're doing. But I just thought that was a pretty marked shift for Amazon. And I think that'll actually play really well for enterprise CIOs.
I think it will. We'll get into it. I think when we talk about the outage, how critically important the outcome conversation is, because I think the outage, when we get to there, highlighted a lot of the apprehension that CIOs and CTOs have when it comes to cloud, and goes into kind of the second thing that, well, when we get into kind of the technical announcements, the mainframe announcement I thought was really interesting. Is you mentioned the market shift that Amazon is in. They have
Mhm.
to grow their enterprise presence, and we know that, kind of the dirty secret or the open secret when someone says that they're all in AWS, when a really big company says they're all in AWS, we've talked to these companies and we know what it really means that they're all in AWS. It means that all of the new stuff is in AWS, but they still have mainframes. They still have uh deck systems. They still have legacy IT systems. It's just no longer on premises in the proper sense. They may be in colos. These systems are centers of gravity,
Mhm.
and there's workloads that could easily be in AWS and the public cloud in general, but they can't move because they're tethered to these big iron systems. And Amazon wants that revenue. They want those systems. They want the mainframe workloads, and they want the systems around those workloads. And they've had problems getting them up into the service.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Keith. I mean, the that concept of all-in cloud has been a misnomer from the get-go. And even the customer conversations I've had, when you dig into it, you realize that it's not just the net new applications that are going that might be all in, but you also have some service offerings for different companies that might be all in. But you're absolutely right. There are pieces that even for some of the companies, and I don't want to just pick on Amazon, but some of the companies that have been showcased by other public cloud providers they've said all in. You dig into it and you realize that it's not truly all in, like the core definition of it, but there are other pieces. And I think to your point, more importantly, is how do you get those other pieces, or how do you start to build value off those other pieces? And I think the mainframe announcement was one of those. I think the other piece that was really interesting is if you really want to attract the enterprise, it's about data. Data, data, data. And you have to also think about how you move up the stack. It can't just be the basic Lego building blocks. There are plenty of companies that want that and will want that into the future, and that's great. But you also have to have some preformed solutions that they can capitalize on, that enterprises can capitalize on, because they don't necessarily have the expertise or the staff or the resources to be able to understand and put this together in a meaningful way, which then will get us to a conversation of the outage in a few minutes. But I think seeing the kind of serverless or low code, no code approach to some of the service offerings now, I just look at some of the database and analytical offerings that Amazon has, where you don't have to manage that underlying infrastructure. That's gold. That's absolute gold, especially as you start thinking about how do I attract enterprise that is going after data, but don't necessarily have the wherewithal to be able to, maybe it's aspirational. They want to go after the nuts and bolts, but they just don't have the ability to get from here to there.
Yeah, the SageMaker, they added to your point, they added a low code, no code option for SageMaker, which you don't need a data scientist to
Hmm.
figure out or answer questions, which is an amazing thing. I kind of predicted this back in 2019. I got to find the blog post, but basically it needs, and it may be, I think 5 or 6 years ago, it was really aspirational to think that using AI ML would be as simple as using Microsoft Excel or simpler. If
Hmm.
you think about the power of, and there's probably nothing more transformative to in businesses in the past 30, 40 years than Microsoft Excel. How many companies still to this date, if you think about like why data transformation is so hard, I can't simply move from one storage array to the public cloud or from one storage array to another storage array because there's Excel spreadsheets that will break that have mission critical
That's
processes
right.
that are tied to a server in my data center. This is what makes public cloud and migrating to public cloud and transforming so difficult that we've built these processes. I, AI ML is going to be the same way. We're going to create as we reduce the friction as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and the big cloud providers, and even SAP and Oracle reduce the friction for AI and ML and getting business outcomes and pushing that closer to the business analyst or even the everyday business user. It's going to, I think it's the next big opportunity.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, for the longest time, Excel has been the widest used analytical tool on the planet. And, from what I see, it continues to be. That's not to say that it's going to necessarily get replaced in some ways, but to your point, we have this big ball of yarn that we have to somehow untangle, and that's the IT estate. And it's going to take time to be able to do that. Your example of Excel spreadsheets that are tied to local data centers or corporate data centers. I mean, that's just one example, and there are many, many, many more. So it will take time. We will have to stop making assumptions like we have in the past that we can touch that data. It's easy to get to. It's a different way of operating when you move to cloud. And so I think that's one thing that we should touch on is part of the outage is some of these changes haven't necessarily taken place within the enterprise.
Yeah, one other technical announcement around data, what happened the day before in the partner keynote. And you're an experienced CIO, so when we have something like a TIPCO or what's the other big data lake type thing that we build applications and services around. Not I'll remember it. I'll remember it later on in
Hmm.
the conversation. But these things become big centers of gravity, and
Hmm.
once the application is built and we have finite resources in the enterprise, our data scientists, our data analysts, our application developers go on to the next project. And those projects that we built that are income generating or business process heavy, we don't change them unless there's absolute need to change them. We work around them, we build around them, but we don't go back and re-platform those things. Not unless we absolutely have to. So one of the things that they announced at the partner summit, part of the reInvent, was data brokering or data vending, the ability to for a TIPCO, and TIPCO is not necessarily somebody who announced this, but this is what I envisioned for TIPCO to vend their API to AWS SDK, and developers can call TIPCO APIs directly via their AWS SDK, and reducing the friction to use your enterprise data that exists today. They had the announcement with NetApp. With it may seem, NFS storage is not that big of a deal, but it is.
Hmm.
That's how we get that spreadsheet that was working in the data center to work in AWS cloud. So these AWS is doing a lot to reduce the friction of getting your applications into the public cloud.
Yeah, and the other piece that you're kind of hinting at there is if you look at QuickSight Q that they talked about as well at the conference, one of the things that I found really interesting is it really exposes the data analytics component to the average business user. And so what this means is similar to how Excel has had such a wide and deep success across the organization as an analytical tool. Why was that the case? Because everyone had it and everyone understood how to use it. So it's accessibility, but it's also a lack of complexity to be able to do what you need to do. And so when I look at Amazon's QuickSight Q, AWS QuickSight Q, I see the same thing. Here's a low code, no code approach to data analytics. And so it potentially opens the door to creating that citizen analyst across your organization. That's not to replace what you might need in terms of data scientists or others with deeper experience, but it starts to open the door to other possibilities that might expose insights that influence key decisions within your organization. And that's going to be really important as we think about the importance of data in decision making, and especially when we start talking about risk across the organization.
So you bring up a really interesting point. I had a recorded a podcast yesterday with Sweetie Young, who's a AI ML expert, and she's writing a book on ethical AI. And one of the things that that I'm intrigued about because of this announcement is the increased risk that organizations run when we push it down, when we push this AI capability down to the average business user.
Hmm.
They may not understand the implications of ethical AI now that they have all of these tools at their disposal. Can I run a query that IT has told me not to run because it violates a ethics moral of the company, or even violates the law?
Right.
Now I have this power. So how do we put controls around, CIOs should be thinking about, and CDOs should be thinking about, as I give these tools to the average business user, how do I ensure that they're trained and they know not to make business decisions that could get the organization in trouble based on algorithms that they create?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Be careful what you wish for, right? I mean, the great thing about artificial intelligence and some of the analytical tools that are coming out is they're incredibly powerful. The downside, they're incredibly
Very
powerful,
powerful.
right? And so, there is an educational process. It's not just, hey, we've got that 13, 14-year-old teenager and throw them the keys to the car and say, hey, go have some fun. Yeah, that's powerful. They can do some amazing things. Maybe they can think about what they could do with that vehicle. Is that necessarily the right thing to do without some guardrails? Probably not. And so I do think that you're absolutely right. We have to be thinking holistically about how we use these tools and use them in an appropriate manner. And it's not just the insights we get from it, but it's what we then do with those insights that affect our decision making. It's kind of like we've seen this in recruiting, for example. If you do analytics on recruiting, you're going to get certain biases that are going to show up because that's the way that things have played out in the past. Is that necessarily what you want to be doing moving forward? No. Is that where your aspirations are? No. But that's where you have to start understanding that looking in the back, in looking in the rearview mirror, is not necessarily going to help you get to the next stage of what you're looking for. And I think ethics is one aspect, but you touched on another piece that's getting incredibly complicated. I recently recorded a podcast with a chief privacy officer, and we went through this issue of regulatory compliance and privacy. And if you look at what the states are starting to work on in terms of privacy requirements, it'll make your head spin. And so, how do you navigate that? As
Yeah.
if moving data into cloud or moving applications into cloud wasn't complicated enough. Now we're talking about policy. Now we're talking about regulatory governance, privacy. How do you bring in risk? How do you bring in cybersecurity into the mix? There's a lot going on.
So this, I think, is a good opening for the second part of the conversation. AWS is really big, and I got I think for the first time at reInvent, I got a sense of how big they were when they announced that they're moving into private 5G, which we didn't talk about, and then they're also moving into basically SD-WAN. And I started to think, I put on my CTO hat and thought, man, you know what? This is super convenient. It is really nice to have one hand to shake, one API, one entry point into managing these different services. As we haven't even talked about Outposts and the Edge and all the great things AWS is doing. But what happens when it breaks? Like, this is not, I don't, we've both been in IT for, 3, 4 decades. I, I might want to say I've been in IT for almost 5
Yeah,
decades. But
let's be careful here.
yeah, let's not go down that right. Let's not go down the right of counting decades. But
Let's just say we both have the scars to show it.
yes. And I don't know if I've ever been in a situation where not even the managed service provider, where we put so much trust in a single entity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's not just trust in a single entity, but there's a lot more at stake these days than there were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And just like for the same reasons why corporate data centers, we moved away from having a single monolithic corporate data center to multiple data centers. We moved away from having a single server that supports an application to a cluster or to a failover setup across multiple data centers or colo facilities. We have to be thinking about the same thing. And there's a lot more at stake now because the switching cost for customers is much lower. Whereas before, if I couldn't get something or technology wasn't working within one company, Okay, we had a backup method. Maybe you switch to paper or switch to another method. That's not the case anymore. If Starbucks is down, I'm going to Pete's, or I'm going to Dunkin', or I'm going to, a different coffee venue. It's not as simple now as to say, okay, you've got your customer locked in and they don't have choice. Customers have incredible choice. And so that just puts a lot more pressure on the nature of the business that we operate, and therefore the technology that we ultimately put underneath it. And so when you start thinking about that and you start to unwind that ball of yarn that I alluded to, and you're moving to cloud, and you're bringing in the concept of risk, and you're bringing in all of the other pieces around regulatory compliance and privacy, you start to see that you could potentially be building a house of cards if you're not careful, but it's very easy to have a hole in the operation, in the operational stability that you're building. There have been a couple of marketing terms that have come up again and again over the last 10 or so years, and they still are being brought up today. And it's really concerning because I think they've really kind of sent enterprises in the wrong direction. One is that cloud is cheaper, and two is that cloud is just someone else's data center. And I think the problem there is it sets the wrong tone for what cloud is and how you use cloud. Is it someone else's data center? Technically, yeah, it is. But does it operate the same way? No, absolutely not. And the way you consume those services has to be thought very differently.
So this gets me to kind of thinking about the non-technical CIO or the non-technical executive, the COO, CFO, CIO that's in charge of making these decisions. And I think the marketing jargon does them a disservice because they understand a data center. They
Mhm.
understand the concept of vendor redundancy. And you look at the public cloud providers. Oh, AWS is a cloud, uh, Google's a cloud, Microsoft is a cloud, and even Oracle and IBM offer clouds. So just like I could move from QTS to Equinox to Digital Realty or have an on-premises data center, I have that level of mobility. Yes, painful, but we can do it.
Mhm.
Multi-cloud, which is I think a concept that gets thrown around a lot about the ability to move from one cloud provider to the next. When we look at how big AWS become, AWS offers, for a sense of scale, AWS offers 475 different instance sizes for EC2, their virtualization platform. That is compared. That may be like four times. I haven't looked up the numbers, but think on a magnitude of like four times bigger than their next largest competitor, which is Microsoft and their Azure solution. AWS offers services that you just can't get from other cloud providers. So
Mhm.
yes, it accelerates the ability for you to deliver services, but this house of cards that you're building, it is it's extremely addictive. So something that we may save for a future conversation is this idea of this impact. And I know you talk about this a lot of hybrid work. And we're being CIOs basically don't have a choice but to support hybrid work. It is the reality of what we're in.
Mhm.
And that in turn changes a lot of our relationships. I just tweeted this out earlier today. What would have been fine, 99.8% reliability would have been fine pre-pandemic for some services. Now we have to go through the exercise and look at all of our services and find out whether or not even three nines is enough, and we need to now go to four nines because the business criticality of VPN or VDI or et cetera.
Right.
These outages now have a much bigger blast radius than they did before. And I think the outage from AWS just this past week highlighted that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. You have to be thinking about your entire stack for the application, right? You have to think about everything from the experience of the user or developer all the way through to the fundamental underlying systems. And what do you have for SLAs along that entire spectrum? And it is a story of the weakest link. I think I said this in the past, but we used to rely on redundancy and resiliency at the infrastructure layer. But when you move to cloud, you have to move that more into the application layers. And so you have to assume that the underlying infrastructure is not necessarily as resilient in the same way. And I don't want this to come across as is to suggest that Amazon is not resilient, but rather the way you architect applications from the top to the bottom has to change. And I don't think that we've necessarily thought through that, especially when you think about lift and shift, another marketing term that I think has kind of sent people the wrong direction or had them make decisions that have hurt them in the long run. But when you start thinking about this outage within the US East 1 AZ for Amazon, okay, it failed, but did the entire Amazon infrastructure go down? No. I mean, other availability zones were perfectly okay. Now, there will be something, kind of to your point about the blast radius, there will be something that will come out of this where there were certain services that we're understanding that relied certain Amazon services for other AZs that relied on services within US East 1. And so when you have those kinds of requirements, yeah, you take one out and it brings down the others for those services. But I think we have to think through that. We have to be thinking differently about resiliency in our services and resiliency in our applications. And cloud is not just someone else's data center. It operates very differently and more so than just capex to opex or use it as you need it and give it back as you don't. There's a lot more at stake here that we have to understand. And I think this outage this week exemplifies some of those core mistakes that we're making.
Yeah, I think it's tough because let's pick on a company both me and you cover, or at least a set of users that both me and you cover, which is SAP.
Yeah.
SAP has not re-architected its platform for the public cloud. It is the monolithic application that you listen to SAP. 70% of the world transactions go through SAP, so it's super critical infrastructure. And the way that we've handled SAP in the traditional enterprise is that we build 4.9s available underlay, which directly infrastructure, which directly translates to 4.9's availability for SAP. We build the infrastructure that matches the application architecture.
Hmm.
Every time I'm involved in the conversation where a customer talks about moving SAP to the public cloud, whether they're hosting it via IaaS or consuming it as a service through a managed service provider, the same conversation happens over and over again. How do I provide the same 4.9's availability that I have in my private data center on an infrastructure that only has that only promises 3.9's? And I've gotten into this conversation a couple of times over the past week, which has been AWS East 1 is over. If you look at probably the past 3 years, is probably performing better than the promised SLA of 3.9's. But they had an outage that did not exceed their SLA. But the perception is that cloud is somehow less reliable than the promise. And I think the mismatch, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think the mismatch is that I expected 4.9's availability in my private data center. We built to that. Public cloud gave me an offer I cannot refuse. I took that offer, but yet the SLA promise does not meet my business requirements. Therefore, the public cloud has failed in its promise. That's what I'm hearing from a
Yeah.
perception perspective. I'd love to hear what you're hearing.
I think we've both seen that over the course of several years, and I completely agree. I would take it a step further and say I think there's an assumption that's been made that the public cloud will provide the same degree of resiliency as what I had in my corporate data center. And whether it's three nines, four nines, five nines, I don't think that's really the issue. You have to look at the entire stack, the entire end to end stack, and understand where is that weakest link. And so when you start to understand how cloud services are architected or how you should leverage them, you have to understand that what they deliver and what you think they're going to deliver are two different things. And so I think Amazon, and we'll know more as we get out of the postmortem of this event, but if you look at past events, my guess is they're delivering exactly what they said that they're going to deliver. Exactly. But I think what is getting people up in arms is that they're frustrated because they expected something different than what Amazon said they would deliver. And it's not just Amazon. You could say the same about Google, the same about Microsoft. I think again, this comes back to how are we building resilience into our application stack. And so if I go to SAP, and let's say I'm getting hosted SAP Cloud, I also want to go through a process of trust but verify, which is to say, help me understand what my expectations should be of your resiliency. Like, what are you delivering to me in terms of that application resiliency? And then from there, it's up to them to determine, okay, what they're running underneath it, whether it's their own corporate data center, whether it's public cloud, colo, whatever it is. That's that I don't care about as a customer. But what I do care about is that they're taking the appropriate steps to be able to deliver on what they're promising in terms of uptime and resiliency. Let me maybe put a real fine point on this. In the last few weeks, several weeks, we've heard two announcements with two different public cloud providers that I think give me a bit of a moment of pause. And one is the CME announcement with Google Cloud, where CME, which is another exchange like NASDAQ, or another exchange company like NASDAQ, and they committed to leveraging Google Cloud. NASDAQ is leveraging Amazon and starting with Outposts as part of that. So it gives them a little bit of insulation. But let's assume that one of these exchanges was running on US East 1 and there was an outage. And let's just assume for a minute that it took the exchange down. What are the ramifications of that? We're not talking about, hey, I can't process your credit card for your coffee. We're talking about taking markets down, which would have significant global economic impact by one outage.
Yeah, I had then that was the point that someone who got into a debate with me about made, which is that look, Nasdaq is moving to the cloud, and they've selected AWS. I didn't know about the CME announcement. I got to tell my son that that was his first internship was at the CME, which he'll get a kick out of that. It from my relationship with him, the CME was not one of the most technically advanced exchanges in the world.
Well, considering they're going to Google, they're going to be really quick.
They're going to be very quick. So I think this is something that customers sometimes get a sticker shock with. This is one of the areas that customers get a sticker shock with. I completely trust NASDAQ will have figured out how to mitigate the risk of 3.9's availability of US 1 East. They would not they would not put processes on that platform without having mitigations. One of the things that one of my debaters said, "Hey, this is 3.9's availability is going to be unacceptable for a financial services company that's doing trading." And I absolutely agree with them. Yes, it will be. Does that change the nature of what you're putting? Does that change the nature of the platform that you're putting your services on? US 1 East is it's funny. It's an incredible, and I don't mean this to as a slight to Amazon. US One East is where all of the innovation from AWS has come out over the past 15 years. It is an amazing platform. It is the oldest platform. Therefore, it is also the platform that has gotten the most outages. It has the longest history, therefore, it has the most outages, and it has developed, right or wrong, a reputation for outages. But if we looked at it, just academically, they have better than performed to their SLA, which is not good enough for something like NASDAQ. So NASDAQ will have to engineer around it. I made this comment that even if I was the CTO or architect within NASDAQ and AWS came to me and said, we promise 4 nines availability for you in US East one, I'd look at them kind of curiously. Like, I'll look at history and you guys haven't performed it in the past. Why would I be the first customer to sign an SLA that promises that availability when you haven't been able to deliver it in the past? I would pass. My assumption is that NASDAQ is building a redundant infrastructure across multiple AWS regions as AWS recommends. And the point of the kind of my rant is you have to build for redundancy on top of a 3 nines infrastructure by adding additional 3 9 infrastructures to mitigate the risk. And that becomes, for a lot of companies, prohibitively expensive versus the revenue that that infrastructure generates for the customer.
Yep. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But it's a different way of thinking. It's a different approach altogether, and it's a different way of thinking. I just bring up the NASDAQ and CME examples as kind of extreme examples of where this is going. And we have to be thinking very differently. So let's maybe kind of sum this up, Keith. Kind of your quick takeaways or takeaway from the overall from the conference, and then also from the outage.
So AWS reInvent 2021 victory lap for AWS. They are the biggest, baddest cloud. The Cube said something that was really funny and true. Dave Nicholson, host of the Cube, former EMC alum, said that they had this saying at EMC that they look at Hitachi, the number 2 storage vendor of the day, their main competitor. It must really feel bad to wake up every morning knowing that you're 1 year further behind us. AWS reInvent showed that Amazon is so far ahead of the competitors. We're still early cloud. Only 15% of workloads are in the public cloud at all. I would have to guess that most of those workloads are born in the cloud,
Yeah.
but Amazon has not taken their foot off the accelerator pedal. It is a great time to be looking at cloud as a way to accelerate your business, but be careful. Be as cognizant and as purposeful as possible when you're selecting Amazon or any other public cloud provider for new services or old services, because the landscape is changing beneath us with COVID and the acceleration of hybrid work. It's accelerating, I think, much faster than any of us can actually realize.
Yeah. No, great wrap up there, Keith. I agree. I'm excited to see what is coming out of Amazon and how things are changing for them. I mean, I've always been impressed by how Amazon has kind of conducted themselves and carried themselves in terms of the products and services that they've delivered. And it's been frankly just impressive. The number of services and class of services that they've been delivering over the 15 years. Um, I like the way that they're approaching things moving forward from more of that outcome basis. I think one of the big blind spots for them historically has been the enterprise. And I think they finally get it that, hey, we've got to figure out how to get the enterprise attracted to us. And I think focusing on outcomes is a great way to do that. So I'm encouraged by that. Definitely reinvigorated to see where that goes. I think as you said, there's a lot of opportunity here in cloud for all of the providers, not just Amazon. And it'll be great to see how not just each of them play, but how they start to play together too. That's the next thing that I'm looking for is more collaborative work between them. Because as we start to think about multi-cloud, which is a reality for enterprises, there's going to have to be more integration that comes about. It's necessary. So I do think that's important. As for the outage, I would say there's a lot to learn here. But the one thing that I would not start with is pointing the finger at Amazon. The first thing I do is step back and think about, so why did this happen? How did this happen? And I don't mean how did the Amazon outage happen? How did the outage to my services take place? What could I have done differently? And as you said, some of the assumptions that you make, I mean, if you cut corners and go with the cheapest route you can, well, okay, there are trade-offs to that. And maybe you do need to spend a little more money. I mean, we're starting to see some of that in supply chain where people are starting to introduce flexibility into their supply chains and manufacturing across multiple countries rather than just China, for example. And so that costs more money, but it provides them with the flexibility because they're realizing they just can't tolerate, their business cannot tolerate the kinds of disruptions that we've been seeing. And so I think people will probably, I hope people will step back from this outage because I don't think that happened in the past US East one or other outages from other providers. But I hope that people step back and kind of look at this holistically and start to understand what cloud is, how it provides services, what they're actually providing, and then how you should architect to get the service that you ultimately want in your application. And that'll take some time. Like I said, I just hope that people look at the big picture and don't just get laser focused on, oh well, Amazon failed, so therefore, they're the problem, they're the culprit. From everything I've seen, that's not the case. There were opportunities to do different things, but choices were made.
All right,
So,
that was a great conversation.
yeah, it was. It was Keith. Thanks so much. Thanks for everyone that was viewing, and would love to hear your comments. So definitely hit us both up. Keith, where can people find you?
If you want to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter at CTO Advisor on the Twitters, and thectoadvisor.com is the website.
Excellent. And for me, you can catch me on Twitter at tcrawford, TCRAWFORD, or on the web at AVOA.com. Keith, thanks so much for taking the time. We're
Thanks
out
for
for
having
now.
me. Bye.